The tallest building in New York City is about 1,770 feet. Now, imagine a wave of the same height, not in a movie, not in a theory. Measured, photographed, documented by the United States government on American soil, within living memory. On a summer evening in 1958, in a remote bay in Alaska, the largest wave in recorded human history climbed 1,720 feet up a mountainside, stripping the forest off the rock like a razor, and then swept the length of the bay toward the open sea. And here is the part that turns this from a geology story into something almost beyond belief. There were people in that bay, 3 small fishing boats, anchored for the night, families sleeping, sat directly in the path of a wave taller than any skyscraper in America. 2 of those boats carried people who lived to describe what they saw, including a fisherman and his 7-year-old son, who rowed their 38-foot boat up the face of it, over the top, and came down the other side alive. 1 boat did not come back. This is the story of Lituya Bay, the night the ocean stood up, the survivors who should not exist, and the reason scientists are watching, right now, for the places in America where it will happen again. Everything you are about to hear is documented fact. That is what makes it terrifying. Start with the bay itself, because Lituya Bay was collecting warnings for 2 centuries before 1958, and almost nobody read them. It sits on the wild outer coast of southeast Alaska, a T-shaped fjord about 7 miles long and 2 miles wide, carved by glaciers, walled by mountains that rise thousands of feet straight from the water. The peaks of the Fairweather Range towering above, including Mount Fairweather itself, over 15,000 feet. One of the highest coastal mountains on Earth, standing barely a dozen miles from the sea. It is astonishingly beautiful, protected, calm, one of the only shelters on 100 miles of brutal open coast. Fishermen have always loved it for exactly that reason, but the bay has a history of eating its guests. Its narrow entrance is guarded by a spit of land where the tide rips through with the force of a river. And in 1786, the first European expedition to chart the bay, a French voyage under La Pérouse, lost 21 sailors in those entrance currents in a single afternoon. Boats swallowed, no bodies recovered. The explorers raised a monument on the island in the bay and named it Cenotaph, the empty tomb, a name it carries to this day. The native Tlingit people, who had lived on that coast for centuries, could have told him the bay was dangerous. Their oral traditions speak of a place of sudden death, of a spirit in the bay that resented visitors, and of a village near the shore, destroyed, in a single moment, by the water rising. For a long time, outsiders filed those stories under legend. You already know, from our Cascadia episode, how that filing usually goes. The legends were data. And there was harder evidence, too, written into the forest itself. Anyone who sailed Lituya Bay with sharp eyes could see it. A strange, crisp line running along the mountainsides. Below it, young trees, alder and brush. Above it, old-growth forest. A trimline, like a bathtub ring, hundreds of feet above the water. In the 1950s, a government geologist named Don Miller studied those lines and reached a conclusion his colleagues found almost impossible to accept. The lines were the scars of giant waves, not ordinary tsunamis, waves hundreds of feet tall, which had swept the bay repeatedly in 1854, 1874, 1899, and as recently as 1936, when a wave nearly 500 feet high had scoured the shores, witnessed by a handful of stunned locals. 4 giant waves in barely a century, in one bay. Miller dated the tree generations along each line, reconstructed each event, and published his findings, arguing that Lituya Bay was a wave machine, that something about its geometry produced monsters, and that it would do it again. Some colleagues thought the numbers had to be wrong. Waves of that scale were simply not in the scientific vocabulary. He was still studying the bay, in the summer of 1958, when the bay settled the argument for him. Now, look at the head of the bay, the top of the T, because that is where the machine's engine sits. 2 glacial inlets meet there, beneath cliffs that rise almost vertically for thousands of feet, and directly across the head of the bay runs the Fairweather Fault, one of the great strike-slip faults of the North America, the same family as the San Andreas, the sliding boundary where the Pacific Plate grinds past Alaska. The fault does not just pass near the bay, it crosses it. The cliffs above the water are fault-shattered rock, steep, fractured, soaked by rain and glacier melt, holding themselves up by friction, millions of tons of stone, leaning over deep water. Hold that picture, a cracked wall of mountain, standing above a narrow, deep, enclosed pool. Lituya Bay is not shaped like a place where waves happen. It is shaped like the instrument they are made with. July 9th, 1958. A beautiful evening. And because this is southeast Alaska in midsummer, still daylight past 10 at night. 3 fishing boats have crossed the entrance and anchored in the Calm, the Idri, carrying Howard Ulrich and his 7-year-old son, the Badger, carrying Bill and Vivian Swanson, and the Sunmore, carrying Orville and Mickey Wagner. A quiet night in the most beautiful anchorage on the coast. At 16 minutes past 10, the Fairweather Fault, which had been locked and loading for decades, ruptured. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake, one of the strongest in Alaskan history to that point, tore along the fault for 100 miles. The ground on one side of the fault lunging past the other by more than 20 feet in places, and the head of Lituya Bay was sitting almost on top of it, on the boats. The crews woke to the anchor chains rattling and the water dancing, the mountains around them groaning, rockfall smoking down the cliffs in the twilight, and the glaciers at the head of the bay, witnesses said, visibly shuddering, throwing bursts of ice. And then, at the head of the bay, the cracked wall let go. An entire mountainside, roughly 40 million cubic yards of rock, a mass with the weight of tens of millions of cars, detached from a height of up to 3,000 feet, and fell, nearly vertically, into the deep water of the inlet below. Physics has a term for what happened next, an impulse wave. But the honest description is simpler. It was the biggest splash in recorded history. Picture the scale, honestly. The rock mass that fell was roughly the volume of 10 million dump trucks, falling the height of 2 stacked skyscrapers, reaching the water at hundreds of miles per hour, and striking a pool of water hemmed in on 3 sides by vertical rock. When that much rock hits enclosed deep water at that speed, the water has nowhere to go but out and up, and it went up, exploding against the opposite mountainside, a sheet of ocean climbing the slope, stripping century-old spruce and hemlock off the rock, snapping trees 6 feet thick like grass, peeling the soil itself down to bare stone, until it reached its high mark, 1,720 feet above the bay. Surveyors measured it afterward from the destruction line. It remained, to this day, the highest wave run-up ever documented on planet Earth, taller than the tallest building in America, higher than most mountains in entire states. The energy involved has been compared to multiple atomic bombs, delivered to a single mountainside, in seconds. And having spent its first fury on that ridge, the displaced water reorganized into a wave, somewhere between 100 and 300 feet high, and began traveling down the 7-mile length of the bay, toward the entrance, toward the open sea, and toward the 3 boats anchored in between. On the Idri, Howard Ulrich heard the rumble from the head of the bay and looked up from his anchor chain to see something his mind refused to process. The wave crossing the bay toward him, a moving cliff of water, throwing spray hundreds of feet as it tore the shorelines apart on both sides. He would later say the sound reached him first. Not a roar exactly, but the sound of the shoreline itself being destroyed. Millions of trees breaking at once. He had, by his own account, about 2 minutes. Think about that budget. 2 minutes, at anchor, with a sleeping 7-year-old below deck and a wall of ocean coming. He tried to raise the anchor. It would not come. The chain jammed, so he did the only thing left. He let the chain run out to its end, turned his bow into the wave, put his son in a life jacket, and, in one of the most human details in this entire story, began talking to the wave, pleading with it as it came on. The wave reached the Idri, and the anchor chain, fixed to the seafloor, snapped like thread. The boat rose, climbing the face, so steep that Ulrich described looking almost straight down his own deck, up, over the crest, and down the enormous back of the wave into the churning water behind it. The boat held together. The man and the boy were alive, and the radio in the little wheelhouse crackled with Ulrich's voice as he broadcast to anyone listening on the coast, telling them what had just happened, words to the effect that all hell had broken loose in Lituya Bay, and that he believed his time had come. Around them, the bay was unrecognizable, a soup of shattered timber, entire trees stripped of bark and branches, ice from the glaciers, and the debris of the destroyed shoreline, with waves still slamming back and forth between the walls like water in a shaken tub, and through that wreckage, in fading light. Ulrich navigated his boat and his son out of the entrance and into the open sea. On the Badger, Bill and Vivian Swanson had even less time, and their story is the one that sounds most like invention, except that it is corroborated by where they were found. The wave reached their anchorage near the mouth of the bay, lifted their boat, and did not put it down. It carried the Badger backward, stern first, up and over La Chaussee Spit, the forested barrier at the bay's entrance, the same spit that had killed La Pérouse's sailors 2 centuries earlier. The Swansons looked down from the crest and saw the trees of the spit passing below their keel. Bill Swanson later estimated they were some 80 feet above the tops of the trees. The wave dropped them in the open ocean beyond. The impact shattered the hull, and the Badger began to sink. The Swansons escaped into a tiny skiff and were pulled from the sea hours later by another fishing boat, alive, carrying a story that would be laughed out of any harbor bar in the world if the evidence were not written 1/3 of a mile up the mountainside behind them. The Sunmore, with Orville and Mickey Jagner aboard, tried to run for the entrance. The wave caught the boat near the mouth of the bay and drove it under. No trace of the Wagners was ever found. They are the 2 lives Lituya Bay took that night, a number that, like Alaska 1964, could have been unimaginably worse, and was small only because the wave rose in one of the emptiest corners of the continent. On an ordinary summer weekend today, that same anchorage might hold 12 boats, and the cruise routes pass just offshore. The next morning, Don Miller, the geologist who had predicted the bay would do this, flew over Lituya in a small plane. Below him, his theory lay proven in the most absolute terms science ever gets. The fresh trimline, the naked gray rock climbing 1/3 of a mile up the ridge, the floating carpet of millions of trees riding the tide out of the entrance in a raft that spread across the sea for miles. Visible, pilots said, from far down the coast. His photographs of that morning are still in the textbooks. It is one of the rare moments in Earth science when a scientist warned precisely, and the planet confirmed precisely within his own lifetime, at the cost of only 2 lives instead of 2,000. Now the science, because the mechanism matters, and it is not the tsunami you know. The tsunamis we covered in our Cascadia and Alaska episodes are tectonic, born when a fault moves the seafloor, long, fast. Ocean-crossing waves that spread their energy across an entire sea. A landslide wave, a megatsunami, is a different animal. It is an impact event, all of its energy delivered to one enclosed body of water in seconds, like the difference between the tide rising and a boulder thrown into a bathtub. The wave it makes is far taller, far more violent, and far more local. Lituya's monster, for all its height, died within the bay. By the time the energy passed the entrance and spread into the open ocean, it was ordinary swell within miles. That is the trade. Tectonic tsunamis threaten whole oceans at modest heights. Landslide waves threaten single bays, at heights no engineering on Earth can answer, which means the entire question of megatsunami safety reduces to one thing: geography. Steep, fractured slopes, standing over enclosed deep water, with people below. Know the setup, and you know every future Lituya on the map. And that is exactly what scientists are doing, right now, because Lituya was not a freak. It was a category. The same setup exists in fjords across Alaska, Norway, Greenland, British Columbia. And the ingredients are actually increasing, because as glaciers thin and retreat, The mountain walls they spent millennia propping up are left standing free, fractured, and unsupported, exactly the condition that fails. Thawing permafrost in the high country loosens the joints in the rock further. The wave machine is not being dismantled by the modern era. It is being loaded. In recent years, researchers spotted a slope in an Alaskan fjord, above waters used by fishing boats and cruise ships, creeping, cracked, holding an enormous volume of rock above deep water. And they did something Don Miller would have approved of. They went public, issued formal warnings, and instrumented the slope, watching it move, modeling the wave it could make. A wave their calculations suggested could rival history's worst. Greenland has already delivered smaller versions in this century, waves over 300 feet in remote fjords, one of which reached a village, destroyed homes, and took lives. And in another Greenland fjord, a rockfall wave recently sloshed back and forth for days, ringing the fjord like a struck bell, a signal detected by seismometers around the entire planet before anyone knew what it was. The Lituya mechanism is not history. It is a live category of American hazard, simply waiting, as always, on geography and time. So, 3 futures for the wave machine and its relatives. Future 1, the most likely in any given year. Stillness. Lituya Bay sits in its ancient beauty, the trimlines slowly greening over, fishing boats anchoring in the calm, most of their crews never knowing the record the walls around them hold. Most years, in most bays, are this year. Future 2, the middle path, near certainty over decades. Another landslide wave, somewhere in the world's fjords, most likely remote, spectacular, measured by instruments that did not exist in 1958, adding another data point to a science that Lituya founded, and reminding coastal Alaska why the monitoring exists. Future 3, the one the warnings exist for. A monitored slope lets go above a water body with people on it, a harbor, a cruise route, a village. The wave will be local, the timeline will be minutes, and survival will come down entirely to whether the warnings were heeded and the maps were drawn, whether we treated Lituya as a story or as an instruction. Here is my honest opinion. After everything the research shows, Lituya Bay is the most important disaster almost no one has heard of, because it proves the planet's ceiling is higher than our imagination. Before 1958, a 1,700-foot wave belonged to mythology, to the flood stories, to the legends that Tlingit told about that exact bay. Legends we now know were probably memories. It took the 20th century's instruments to confirm what oral tradition had archived for centuries, and it took 2 survivors on fishing boats to give it a human voice. A man turned his boat into a wave taller than a skyscraper with his child beside him and lived. That happened in America, and somewhere on the coast of Alaska, the next cracked slope is leaning over the next quiet bay, with the patience this channel keeps meeting, in fault after fault, mountain after mountain. Nature does not exaggerate, we just underestimate. Lituya Bay is the permanent, measured, photographed proof. So, now I want to hear from you. Before this video, had you ever heard of Lituya Bay? And be honest, if I had told you a 1,700-foot wave happened in America, with survivors, would you have believed it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if you fish, boat, or cruise the Alaskan coast, tell me if you have ever anchored somewhere that felt, in hindsight, like a trap. If this story amazed you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And subscribe with notifications on, because next, we leave the mainland entirely for the most closely watched island in America, where an entire flank of an active volcano, a block of land the size of a small state, is slowly sliding toward the Pacific, and scientists have mapped the ancient waves its ancestors made. Hawaii is moving. That story is next. The ground beneath America is speaking. Make sure you are listening.